Hello everyone, I'm Mirza and today I'm gonna create a very simple counter with function and class components. Actually, I want to show you the differences between these two types of components. So let's get into it. First of all, let's open up app.js and I want to replace my codes here instead of these ones. So let's delete it. Now I need to put a div with the class name of container, and this div needs to have some styles. So let's open up app.css and I'm writing my own styles instead of these ones. So let's do it. Actually, these styles would be used for centering everything that will be into the div. Gap would be to rem, and justify content is center. Align items would be center as well. Okay, it's done. Now it's the time for creating our function and class components. Let's add a new folder, components. Let's add a file, we call it counter function.jsx. And it's time for creating a function component here in counterfunction.jsx. Actually, React.js documentation says that the simplest way to define a component is to write a JavaScript function, something like this. Function. The name of the function is counter function. And so a function component is just a plain JavaScript function that accepts props as an argument and return a React element. Accept props as an argument and return a React element. A React element can be something like this. This is a counter function. Now we want to use this counter function into the app. So we need to export default counter function. Now here into the app we can import counter function and use it here into the app. So import counter function from components folder, counter function module. So now we can import counter function easily. Save the changes back in the browser and we can see this is a counter function. Now this counter function is supposed to increment and decrement a count value. So we need a state for putting a count value into it. For creating a state in function component, we have to use useState hook. Let's import useState. Import useState from React. Now we just write const count set count equals to useState. The only argument to the useState hook is the initial state. If I set it to 0, so the initial state of count state will be 0. But what is the use state. What does use state return? Actually, it returns a pair of values, the current state, and a function that updates the current state. So if you want to update the value of the count, we need to use set count. But how? Let's do it with an example. Okay, counter function is supposed to increment and decrement of the count state via set count. So we need to add two buttons, one of them for incrementing the count state and another one for decrementing the count state. If you click the button of incrementing, the function of handle increment would be called. So the function of handle increment would be called. Now we need to define handle increment function here. I prefer using arrow function here. Okay, so handle increment is supposed increment the count state via set count. As I told you before, set count is a function that updates the state. So we just write something like this here into the handle increment. Set count is changing the count state like this. Count equals to count plus 1. That's it. But we need to change const to let because count is not a constant value. Now we need to show the count here. For example, here we are showing the count state. Save the changes, back in the browser, and if we click the button we can see the changes. Do the same for handle decrement function. It would be handle decrement. It decrements the count state. And if we click here, handle decrement would be called. Save the changes, back in the browser, and we can see the changes. Now it's the time for creating a class component. Let's add a file in components folder. I call it counterclass.jsx. Counterclass.jsx. First of all, I need to import component from React because every class extends from component. So let's do it. Import component from React. This component I've just imported here has a bunch of methods we're going to inherit in the counter class. Now let's define a counter class. The name of the class would be counter class extends component. As I told you, every class component extends from component. The component I've just imported here, and it has a bunch of methods we're going to inherit the counter class. Okay. Now I need to export counter class as well. Export default counter class. Okay. Now this class needs to return something. For return something in class component, we have to use return inside render, like this. Render inside render, I need to use return. Okay. Something like this. I can write here. This is a counter class. It's done. It's a very simple class component without any function. Now let's add it into app.js. Import counter class from components folder, counter class file. Let's add it here, counter class. Save it back in the browser, and yes, that's it. This is a counter class. Now, how can we have a state in a class component? So here we need to add a property called state and set it to an object. So I can add my state here. I need a count state here, so I put a count here with the initial value of 0. So now I have a count state with the initial value of 0. So for accessing the count state, I just need to write something like that. This dot state dot count. Actually, state is a property of class, and for accessing the property of class we need to use this. So we just can write something like that, this dot state dot count. Now it would be 0. Save the changes, back in the browser, and we can see 0 here. Now it's the time for updating the count state. So let's add a button for incrementing the count state. This one would be this dot handle increment, and another one would be handle decrement. So I need to define handle increment and handle decrement function. Handle increment would be a function. Handle decrement would be a function as well. Before to updating the count state, I want to show you something. In handle increment, I want to log this dot state dot count. What would be happen? Let me show you. It would be like that. Okay. If I click plus button, we've got an error. Cannot read property state of undefined. Why is that? Because this is undefined. In types of functions, this is undefined. So how can we solve this problem? For solving this problem, there are two ways, and I want to describe these two ways. First one is we're gonna add a constructor. We're gonna add a constructor, and Actually, constructor is a method that is called when an object of a class is created. So whenever an object of a class is created, the first thing would be run is constructor. Okay, so in the constructor at this point we do have access to this. As you remember, we didn't have any access this in handle increment and handle decrement, but in constructor we have access to this. So if I log this, save the changes, back in the browser, must call super constructor indirect. Okay, we forgot to call super. We need to call super method as well into constructor, because constructor was added in this child class first. So we have to call constructor of the parent class using the super class keyword. Okay, save the changes, back in the browser. Yeah, as you can see, it's our this. So this in constructor is accessible, but in this function is not accessible. So we just need to actually bind this to handle increment and handle decrement in constructor. We just need to write something like this. This dot handle increment, this dot handle increment equals to this dot handle increment dot bind this. Let's do it for handle decrement as well. Dot handle decrement. Okay. We bind this to handle increment and handle decrement. Now in handle increment we can access to this. If we log this, let me write something like that. This in handle increment, handle decrement. Okay. Save the changes, back in the browser. Let's refresh the page. As you can see, now we can access to this. This in handle increment, this in handle decrement. So now we can access to this because we bind this in constructor to handle increment and handle decrement. There is another way for accessing to this in function of handle increment and handle decrement. In this approach we don't need constructor, so let's delete it, and we just need to convert this function to an arrow function. That's it. Now we can access to this in handle increment and handle decrement. Actually this approach is very simpler and more cleaner, so I prefer using this approach. Save the changes, back in the browser. If I click, we can access to this. Yeah, this approach is very cleaner. Now it's the time for updating the count state. because now we can access to this .state.count. Okay, we can't modify the state directly. For example, if I do write something like this .state.count plus plus, it doesn't work. Actually, if I click to plus button, it doesn't work. So how can I update my state, my count state? So we need to use setState method. This method tells React that updating the state, then it will figure out what part of state is changed, and based on that it will bring the DOM in sync with virtual DOM. So let's use it here. I need to write this use state. Sorry, set state. This set state, and here as the argument to set state method we pass an object. Okay, so here is the argument to set state method. We pass an object, and the properties of this object will be merged with what we have in the state object. Okay, so I need to put count set to this .state .count plus 1. I hope it works. Yeah, it works, and you can see that updating the state. We will do it for handle decrement as well. Now if I click, you can see the use state changes. Yeah, that's it. The last thing that I want to talk about is props. Actually, props in class components will be accessible by this .props. For example, I want pass this text to counter class via this via its parent. So I'm cutting this text, and I want to pass it to a counter class. So counter class would have a property, I call it text. Now counter class has a property text that its value is, this is a counter class. Okay, counter class has a property text. How can I use this property? I can use this property or props via this .props. So I write this .props .text. Text is the name of the props here. Save the changes, back in the browser. As you can see, this is a counter class here. Okay, and props in the counter function. Props in the counter function will be accessible by this argument, props argument. Okay, I want pass this text to counter function via its parent. Now counter function has a property that name is text with the value of this is a counter function. So counter function has a property that its name is text. I can add here props dot text. Okay, save the changes back in the browser, and you can see this is a counter function here. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if I had any mistakes in my English and coding, forgive me for that, because it was the first time I uploaded a video on YouTube. And I will put my code on my Git as well. You can see my Git address in the description of the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.